Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world joining us to say. They say that a leader is a person you would follow only to a place that you wouldn't go to by yourself. And let me tell you something. The folks that I have on the line right now are folks who have been to some pretty scary places when it comes to cybersecurity situations. The next 30 minutes, I will be engaging them in a conversation on what C-suite can be looking at when it comes to the current world that we're living in, the pandemic of COVID-19. I have with me today Admiral Michael Rogers, Charles Bloner, Nadav Zafri. And I want to thank the team from Team 8 for taking the time to ensure that this session could happen. I know there was a lot of last minute running around, but as they always say, well done is better than well said. We set the idea in our heads that we wanted to do this session, and well done, we're making it happen. Let's jump right into it without wasting any time. Charles, I'm going to begin with you. And I want everybody else to weigh in as well, but I'll direct the question first to you, Charles. Charles, you've been you've been a CISO of one of the biggest banks. And right now, you're beginning to observe how quickly these banks, financial institutions, large enterprises are adapting to new technologies and digitized technologies amidst the pandemic. More attacks, more reasons to protect yourself. Is this sudden rush something that is sustainable? And how can we ensure we remain proactive in our cybersecurity postures?
So, first of all, thank you. I mean, I'm not used to being put in the company of an admiral and a general. As a person who's never followed anyone's orders ever, I was the CISO through a number of different crises at JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, and at Citi. And so, like, at the core of your question is, has the job of the CISO changed at all as a result of COVID? And I'll tell you, it really hasn't. The core of the job of a CISO is to understand what their critical assets are and protect them everywhere to the best of your ability. Now, the thing about COVID is everything else in the world has changed, all right? You have to sit down and take a step back and think about what are your critical assets, because they may be different now. You have to think about the change in the threat landscape because it may be different now. The technology, as you talked about, pace of change is clearly different. Personally, I don't believe that pace of change is sustainable. There's only so much you can do on adrenaline. But what I think it has showed us is that we do have the ability to move faster than we might have thought. And so the future expectation will be not running like a crazy person all the time, but running a lot faster than might have been the norm before. And so I don't know, Nadav or Mike, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think the biggest impact in some ways is that this is acting as an accelerator of trends that were already evident. And what you're seeing is this is just providing greater impetus. The other challenge I think associated with pace is both your ability to actually sustain it, but it also a big part of it to me is what is the risk appetite of different organizations? Because one of the early things that was interesting about COVID-19 was you saw a lot of leadership. I'm not talking about necessarily at a CIO or CISO level, but at a chief operating officer, at a CEO, at a board level, you saw a willingness in some ways to accept increased risk. Hey, we acknowledge by dispersing, cybersecurity becomes a tougher problem set, but hey, we don't have a choice, just do it. And so it'll be interesting to see, does that risk appetite continue over time? I don't think so necessarily, but it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that the current of adoption of new technologies and trends is unsustainable. However, the trajectory of overnight moving to a new workforce style is irreversible. And in this new style, cyber is not going to be something that's a rear view. Let's make the infrastructure and then go see how to secure it. But rather, cyber is becoming the fabric of everything that organizations do, especially, organizations that are about services and IT, big data, analytics, etc. And so I think cyber is going to become a differentiator, not only as security, but also the ability to be more agile, hence more competitive.
I think, I'm hearing a couple of comments coming in, so I'm getting different streams. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to weave in the questions, and I'm sure you folks will enjoy this if we involve the participants. Forewarned is forearmed, and a question that's come in is that great, a lot of organizations, enterprise, have been agile, they've been able to sort of move one way and the other simultaneously, and do, the wording here is do some pretty fancy digital acrobatics, but from a sustainability standpoint, we have to talk about finances. And how could we continue to budget in such an unknown situation? Does anybody want to jump in on budget and preparation amidst the pandemic?
Well, maybe, I don't know, Mike, you two both built budgets signed by Congress or the equivalent. I just had to get a board of directors to sign off on mine. I think there's actually going to be a lot of variation depending on the industries that you're in. There are some industries like hospitality that the pain that they're feeling right now is quite honestly unimaginable without any short-term relief in sight. And so that's going to be a place where you're going to have to figure out just how to keep the lights on. But the reality is, if I talk to a lot of folks in some of the top tier banks and others, they're actually, they're not seeing budget reductions. For them, it's a question of how they're rebalancing, all right? The things that you thought were important before are going to be different. You may be making more investments now in automation. And making more investments in things that make your teams smarter, like lateral movement detection being something that you would do in your SOC. Those are the kinds of things that I think are going to still be the portfolio in the front. Everything having to do with cloud is going to be accelerated investment. And honestly, that means there's going to be some underlying investment in identity. Because if you don't get that right, a lot of other things fall apart. And so it's going to be about rebalancing your what you've got, and also to some degree taking a step back and saying, okay, I spent X amount of money on pick your vendor of choice last year. Am I getting the most out of last year's investment also? And so I think a lot of companies will sort of take a step back and say, how do I maximize the investments I've already made?
Yeah, I think that the challenge remains prioritization. And the challenge becomes now, so what's important now and in the future versus what was important to me 3 to 6 months ago? And they're not going to be synonymous, but I have never run into a CIO or CISO who said to me, I got all the money, I got all the resources I need. Hell, I can remember in a previous life telling a president of the United States, sir, you cannot write a check to get us out of this. Money isn't going to solve all the problems here. This is about, and he just looked at me like, you don't want more money? I said, that's not what I'm saying, sir. I am saying we can't, money isn't going to be enough. There's other things we got to do.
I think the last thing I would add to that is that I think CISOs will need to explain or convince to get their budget based on business risk instead of controls. So I think in the fact it was, or CISO would walk in to the CFO or CIO or CEO or the board audit committee and say, here's how dangerous the world is, and so I need more people, more money, more attention. I think that's going to change. I think it's going to be based on what are you doing for the business? What is the risk for the business? What's the probability of risk? In that sense, cyber risk is going to be much more similar to other risks that business leaders lead all the time.
Yeah, hey, Ali, I know I'm breaking disruption here, but I think to an important point Nadav made, one of the implications for the future for CISOs, for me, is you have got to increase the level of interface and integration between the IT and cybersecurity world and the business operation world. If businesses are going to pivot and change their model in particular, coming out of this crisis, that needs to be worked up front with your IT and cybersecurity professionals, not as a after the fact, hey, here's where we're going. Oh, by the way, make this secure. Oh man, that is such a bad way to do business.
Absolutely. And I know I'm getting a lot of comments coming in, and I'm seeing some people who are in here as well. So just so you're aware, we've got folks like Adriana Gliga from M&P. We have Christopher Gillis, Durham College, Bashir Fancy, a well-known cybersecurity professional here, Graham Berry as well. Quite a few folks from the Canadian and North American context and the South Asian context listening in, and they're all throwing in their questions. I have a friend from Huawei as well. So this is phenomenal. I'm just going to reach in all the questions. Another one that's come in is, I'll try to rephrase this, is, we're in this situation with, where the winds of change are blowing, right? And you can either build yourself a wall or build a windmill. It's your call. But one thing that's becoming very apparent is that no more is the cybersecurity professional, especially the leads, the CISOs, no longer are they just sitting in their silo saying, this is the cybersecurity cubicle that we sit in. They're getting intricately involved with different elements of the business. Is the identity of the CISO and security professionals now changing such that they're intricately involved in every step of the operational process and transaction within an organization? Your thoughts?
I think that's a good thing directionally. I think most CISOs would say they would aspire to be in a place where they're involved in everything that's happening within the organization. But I do think, to your initial point, the role of the CISO is very different than it used to be. I've been a CISO. I mean, I became a CISO the first time over 20 years ago at JP Morgan. And the nature of the role is dramatically different. The nature of the role today is as much as anything about educating senior managers and the board of directors to understand that this is just a fundamental business risk, so that they can make good choices. The role of the CISO 10 years ago was the design of a firewall or which antivirus product you might be buying. The core about knowing what you need to protect and protecting it hasn't changed, but the nature of the conversation a CISO needs to have today has to be very different than the nature of the CISO's conversation used to be.
Anyone else want to chime in on that, Con? Go ahead.
I'll just say one thing and also leverage something that you said in the beginning. You said that leaders are people that, others follow into places they wouldn't go by themselves.
Yeah.
I think from that perspective, here's what I would suggest to the CEO. It's okay to follow your CISO. It's even okay to follow your CISO with your eyes closed for some of the time, but every once in a while, you want to open your eyes to make sure that your CISO's eyes aren't closed. I'm paraphrasing from the first Prime Minister of Israel. That is, the CEO must be able, and this chimes into what Charles said, the CEO must be able to understand enough to be dangerous, to ask the right questions at the right time. And so leadership in organizations that are responsible, it could be the CRO, it could be the CFO, the CIO, or the CEO, must be able to ask the right questions so that their CISOs need to optimize or may optimize their security stack. Because again, we're not going back to where we were. And CISOs that are going to be about controls and about risk and about what cannot be done are just not going to drive the business. And so I think in some ways, the CISO will have to become the wingman for the CEO.
And as we're looking at, sort of a leadership outlook, and that's the title of this discussion, right? A leadership outlook despite a failure of imagination. Obviously, we couldn't have imagined these situations. It's now becoming more and more apparent, and again, I'll leave this as an open question, is that understanding global event indexes, understanding what's happening at multiple levels is now becoming more and more integral to the role of a CISO, being socially, politically in the know-how and multiple other layers. So there is a question that has come in, and I'll layer that in, is in these situations, how does a CISO maintain their composure, And two, how do you stay abreast of everything and one step ahead, knowing the unknowns? What are some tips and some suggestions that you would give to C-suite and similar C-suite like yourself? Anyone can feel free to jump in on this.
I'll jump in. So I think part of it starts with a recognition that, hey, this concept of professional development is something that always continues and you must be open to it. And that professional development changes as your level of responsibility and as the expectation of your performance increases. And I think the broad premise is extremely important. The teams that I've been a part of, I always try to talk to the team about, guys, we have to understand the context in which we execute our assigned responsibilities. It's not enough just to do our whatever we're told to do and then, hey, it's up to somebody else. If we really want to be effective, if we really want to maximize our capabilities, if we want to exceed expectations, it's our ability to understand, which hopefully then leads to anticipation and insight. That's going to make us better at what we do. We'll generate more value if we can work like that. So I think that becomes very important.
Yeah, I would add like three things for the CISOs, but I think this is generally true for leadership in this time. The first thing is every once in a while, zoom out. No pun intended, meaning it's so easy to get entrenched in the details and miss the big picture. You must zoom out every once in a while and ask yourself fundamental questions. What kind of business am I protecting? What is the business going through right now from many directions? Who might the adversaries be and how have they changed? What's happening with my team? How is my SOC operating when they can't sit in the same place face to face? How does that affect them? You must zoom out every once in a while, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, or sometimes 5 times a day, and get the big picture. That's number one. Number two, don't underestimate the impact of working from home from the security perspective. We have gone from 5% of the workforce working remotely to 95% of the workforce. That's dramatic overnight. We haven't stress tested that. Yes, true, the foundations haven't broken, which is tremendously important and reassuring. However, we haven't stress tested this. And so now is the time, after we kept the light, we were able to keep the lights on. Now we have to look at the details. And then the last thing I would say on a personal level, look, this is a long haul. So for two things about that. One thing is language. If you're just sitting at home and doing the same schedule that you did when you were in the office, something is wrong because you're in a different situation. If you're using the same vocabulary, if you haven't made up new words to manage this situation, something is wrong. And then the last thing is sort of the most trivial, but many of us are not doing it, is you must take care of yourself. If you're not sleeping, if you're not eating, if you're not exercising, you're not going to come through the other side the way you want to.
For that, and I believe this also ties into a comment that's just been made, is that moving into different scenarios doesn't change who you are as a person. It just changes the look that you have, or the view that you have outside of your window, which leads me to ask, from a perspective of right now, the C-suite, especially the CISOs, locked and grinding away at ensuring that the lights stay on, but they're secure while they're on, making sure communications are going out. There's a consistent bombardment of what they need to do in order just to keep the situation safe. What kind of resources do you recommend that C-suite and CISO should be looking at in terms of increasing their awareness and also making sure that they're being mindful of their environment? Any suggestions on resources? Anyone again?
Mike, you want to start?
Go ahead, George.
I don't know that you need to add resources. I do think right now it's actually a good time to opportunistically be hiring as a general rule, because there are going to be resources that may not have been in the market because of uncertainties that may become available. So you want to do that. But I think the question is really an incredibly broad one. What I would say you want to focus in on right now is just people who've got good common sense and business acumen, and I don't know how to best express it, but I mean, they just sort of get the understanding of this as a risk management discipline, and get the understanding that the conversations you have to be very tailored. And so if you're looking for someone, get yourself a good communications person, all right? Because you don't want to be talking about bits and bytes and an encryption and authentication to the board, but you may want to the CIO. And so I think at times when the system is really stressed, really good communications, and these guys will know much better than I do, so let them reflect on this. But I think in times of high stress, really good communications is critical. So if I'm a CISO and I'm adding one resource, I'm adding someone that helps me communicate better.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And we've got about 9 minutes, and I want to get some other comments in, and I'll weave in another question which has come in from one of our advisors, Mr. Bashir Fancy, where he says, looking at how the situation that we're in, is it time now for the reporting structure of the CISO to change? What are your views on this? I'd like to give you each about a minute to discuss this. Anyone can take the floor.
Yeah, hey Nadav, George, I'll jump in. So yes, I think one of the questions I would be asking myself if I was a CISO right now is, what are the structure and what are the processes that I should be putting in place that are going to optimize success in this process we're going through? And I think that that's different than structure and processes in some ways, not across the board, but in some areas. I think that's going to be different. It's a different skill set. It's an access to a different set of insights, and it's an access to a different kind of people in some ways, not in all ways, don't mean to pretend that, but I think yes. And Nadav, I know you had an input.
Yeah, I would say the following. One thing hasn't changed, and Charles said it before, which is the basics. You got to keep the basics, hygiene, etc. And you want to make sure that you don't fall on the little things, and those haven't become less important, but more important. Correct. That's not going to change. You just got to be super meticulous on maintaining that hygiene again and again and again and again, even more so than before. The change is how do you plan for the future amidst uncertainty and complexity? And that's a different skill. Now, embracing complexity sounds amorphic, but what that means in reality is that you have a limited capability to influence the outcome by working centrally. That means that at the edge, every individual will have more impact on the total outcome in a way that's not predictable.
Correct.
That's what complexity is all about. And we are in a truly complex environment. And so what you need to do in this kind of environment, this is my advice to you, is you need to be, and Charles spoke about how you articulate, you need to be articulating what the outcome must be, but you cannot be prescribing how to get there. Because in many times, people at the edge, people that are working for you, will have to make small decisions that may have a huge effect if they know what the outcome must be. If you put so you give them guardrails, you tell them what the outcome is, you explain your vision, and you expect them to use their common sense to make local decisions. That's probably the number one thing that I would recommend. The second thing is you have to make assumptions as a leader. And then you have to decide to assign probability to these assumptions. And following that, you have to make some of these assumptions working assumptions, meaning we don't know if this is going to happen, but we assume that this is going to happen with such probability. Hence, we're optimizing for that outcome. This is the second probability. Hence, we're optimizing these resources for that outcome.
I agree. And just to sort of weave in the last question, and then we will wrap up with some concluding remarks. There's sort of this sentiment that's coming out where you spoke about this idea of knowing where to take decisions and having a sense, making some assumptions. A lot of this is driven by data, and we're kind of getting bombarded by data. How do you know now what to report on and what's valuable to go after? Let's take that as the closing challenging question, and then we'll conclude. Again, the floor is open to anyone who wants to jump in.
So let me jump in first because I had a bit of a reputation as a freak in the space. So my monthly metrics deck when I retired from Citi was almost 400 pages long of detailed metrics. All right. That was necessary for me as the security leader of the organization to manage on a day-to-day basis. But I never showed any of those metrics to the board of directors, right? The farthest it went is to what we called our CIO council. You're going to need a ton of data to effectively manage on a day-to-day basis. But the board of directors wants to know the big picture. They want to know, are you doing the right thing by our clients? Are we ensuring the operational integrity of our production infrastructure, right? I mean, unless you've got someone who's just a geek in the space, most board members aren't going to ask you what percentage of machines are more than N-2 out of date on AV DATs, right? As a CISO, you need to measure that. Do you never need to talk about that? No. So I think you need an insanely rich source of data, but think about its usage as for how you operate, not how you necessarily communicate upwards.
Admiral Rogers, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I'm going to take a slightly different tack than Charles. One of the things that I always tried to tell the teams I was a part of was you must acknowledge and you must be prepared to operate in a world in which knowledge is imperfect. And as a leader, as I tried to develop the following generations of leaders that I knew were going to come behind me, one of the things I always tried to tell them was, one of the things that marks your transition in your development as a leader is your ability to generate more comfort in uncertainty and complexity. For some people, that's relatively easy. For others, it is really challenging. They just don't, it really locks them up. I said, data is important to us, and we want to use data to drive decision-making and prioritization as best we can. But remember, it's about converting data to insight and knowledge. It's not just about raw numbers of data, because we'll get inundated. But secondly, as important as data is, please don't allow this to lock us down into a culture where we don't make decisions, we don't take risk, and we're so obsessed with, we got to have data that shows us. And I'm not trying to say that what Charles said is invalid in any way.
No, I actually think both of what we're saying is completely complementary, and both of the things need to exist at the same time.
Because I think that's going to be really important for CISOs in this environment. We don't know exactly what the future is going to be here. And you can't hold yourself in paralysis waiting, well, I'm not going to make any fundamental bets and I'm not going to articulate a vision until I have high certainty and a lot of data. I don't think that gets your organization where you need to. I know Nadav wanted to say something.
No, I think I would just add to what you already said, is that from a leadership perspective, I would suggest three things. One is have a clock that everybody knows, because as long as you're in crisis, if people know that you're going to close the door for new data by tomorrow at 12 o'clock, they know that you tell them, listen, tomorrow at 12 o'clock, I'm making a decision based on the data that I have, not the data that I don't have. Whoever brings that data until then, great. After that, I'm making the decision based on the data that I have. Second is assign different names for different data. Is it an assumption? Is it a fact? Is it a rumor? Assign names to data. What is the how much can I rely on that data? And the final thing, which I think is more important than anything else, is make a decision on when the decision has to be made. sometimes it has to be made right now. Sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it does make sense to wait a couple of more hours, days, weeks, or months to get new data. Assigning the timing of the decision making and communicating it to everybody is essential.
Yep. I think this idea of there being lots of data and tons of it, and what we call data lakes, and although I don't necessarily subscribe to the term, you cannot afford to be in that analysis paralysis like situation. Now, there are a lot of questions that have come in. What I can commit to you is I will synthesize the questions over the weekend and send it out to your team. If you have the time, you could respond, or if there is an appetite for it, we'll try and organize a future session. Thank you to the team at siberX for making this happen. I know folks have to go into other sessions, but I want to summarize this by thanking everybody for joining, all of our participants from around the world. We had approximately 85 people on here, and with other sessions running as well. So about 600 people at a time right now must be logging into different sessions, which is phenomenal. And another 500 in the other education track. So that's quite nice. Great job, siberX. I'll summarize this session by saying this, that look, great leaders don't focus on fixing the old, they focus on building the new. And I think here's the lesson that you're beginning to learn, is that it's time to focus on building the new, and no better people than the folks who have done it before and continue to do it to learn about this from. So thank you again once more. I wish you all a very good remainder of the conference. The rule is that if you win the car at the closing, send that car to me. But other than that, you're good to go to enjoy the rest of the conference. And if you're heading out, then enjoy the weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy. And once again, to the folks from Team 8, I really appreciate your time, and I hope you found this valuable. Take care. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.